Water does not shout. It waits. In the medieval world, survival depended on whether that waiting could be persuaded. A river beside a village looked harmless, almost generous, yet one missed season meant hunger. Fields cracked. Grain failed. Bells rang differently when harvests were thin. What changed everything was not rain, but control. Hands learned to bend flow without breaking it. Quiet channels slipped through earth like deliberate thoughts. Behind monasteries and stone bridges, unseen systems moved with patient intention. Water began to listen, and when it did, villages changed shape in ways no army ever could. A field in spring carried more uncertainty than romance. Seeds rested in cold soil, waiting for warmth and moisture in exact proportion. Too much water suffocated roots. Too little left them brittle. Medieval farmers understood balance long before they could measure it. They watched clouds like scholars reading fragile manuscripts. They traced slopes with bare hands, feeling how water wished to travel. Small ditches appeared, then widened. Earth was lifted, shaped, persuaded into guiding flow. The land itself became an instrument. What looked like simple farming concealed calculation, memory, and inherited technique. And beneath those furrows, quiet ambition gathered strength. Monasteries became unlikely laboratories. Behind thick stone walls, monks studied more than scripture. They mapped streams, recorded seasonal shifts, and noted how frost changed flow. Discipline shaped their days, and that discipline extended to water. Channels were carved with geometric care, guiding rivulets toward gardens and fish ponds. Food security meant spiritual stability. Hunger invited unrest of another kind. In cloistered silence, hydraulic knowledge accumulated quietly. Visitors saw prayer. Beneath their sandals, calculation moved. What began as survival slowly evolved into mastery. And outside those walls, neighboring villages started to imitate what they barely understood at first glance. Rivers powered more than thirst. Along their banks rose wooden wheels taller than houses. Watermills turned grain into flour with relentless rhythm. The sound carried across valleys, steady as a heartbeat. Yet the mill required regulated flow. Too fierce, and machinery splintered. Too weak, and stones slowed to useless friction. Sluice gates were introduced, simple wooden barriers that decided how much force could pass. Suddenly, water obeyed a timetable. Labor shifted. Fewer hands ground grain. More hands cultivated land. Efficiency altered village hierarchy in subtle ways. Control over the gate meant influence. And influence rarely stayed modest for long. In drier regions, reliance on rainfall was a gamble too dangerous to accept. Communities dug wells deeper than memory. They constructed canal-like tunnels, gently sloping underground channels that carried distant mountain water toward thirsty plains. The work demanded patience and collective trust. One miscalculation could collapse an entire section, but success meant resilience. Fields once abandoned began to green again. Settlements expanded around reliable sources. Ownership of water became defined not by proximity to rivers, but by engineering skill. The earth concealed arteries of survival, and whoever understood those hidden veins possessed quiet power beyond visible borders. Marshlands posed a different challenge. Excess water swallowed opportunity. In low-lying regions, communities built embankments and drainage channels, reclaiming land from slow, patient flooding. Wooden stakes were hammered into soft ground. Earth was piled carefully, layer by layer. Over time, wetlands transformed into arable fields. The process demanded coordination beyond a single household. Entire villages labored together, understanding that one weak barrier endangered all. Cooperation became necessity, not virtue. The landscape itself testified to collective discipline. What had once mirrored gray skies began to reflect golden grain. Yet maintenance never ended. Water always remembered its former path. Terraced hillsides changed the meaning of gravity. In mountainous regions, farmers carved steps into steep slopes, preventing rain from rushing downward unchecked. Each terrace held soil like a patient palm. Water slowed, settled, nourished. Stone retaining walls required precision. A single failure could trigger cascading collapse. Yet once completed, the landscape resembled an amphitheater of cultivation. Crops grew where only rock had seemed possible. Travelers paused in disbelief. These were not random scars upon nature, but deliberate negotiations with elevation. The mountain was not conquered. It was persuaded, and persuasion demanded knowledge passed quietly through generations. Floodplains offered abundance and danger in equal measure. Seasonal rivers swelled beyond their banks, depositing fertile silt while threatening entire settlements. Medieval communities studied these rhythms carefully. They built levees not to eliminate flooding entirely, but to shape it. Channels diverted excess water toward designated basins, transforming chaos into strategy. Timing became everything. Gates opened and closed with practiced judgment. When managed well, floods became allies, enriching soil without destroying homes. Children grew up measuring seasons not by calendars, but by rising watermarks on stone. Yet one misread current could undo years of planning in a single night. Irrigation required law as much as labor. When water became guided, it also became contested. Villages established shared rules defining who could draw from canals and when. Disputes were settled not only with argument, but with measurement. Simple markers etched into stone recorded allocation. Bells signaled rotation changes. Trust formed the invisible infrastructure beneath physical channels. Without it, systems fractured. A farmer taking more than agreed risked more than anger. He threatened collective survival. Governance grew from necessity. Authority over water gradually intertwined with local power structures. And those structures began shaping economies far beyond the fields themselves. Crop rotation thrived where water was predictable. Reliable moisture allowed experimentation. Three-field systems expanded, alternating grains with legumes to restore soil nutrients. Irrigated plots produced surplus beyond subsistence. Surplus meant trade. Markets emerged around dependable harvests. Grain traveled farther, feeding towns that no longer farmed themselves. Water management quietly fed urban growth. What seemed rural ingenuity became urban possibility. Bakers in distant cities depended on unseen channels miles away. A broken embankment in one valley could ripple into shortages elsewhere. Interdependence deepened. Water no longer sustained only a field. It supported networks stretching beyond immediate horizons. Engineering was rarely written, yet it was everywhere. Wooden flumes carried water across uneven ground, suspended above gullies like fragile bridges. Joinery mattered. A slight misalignment leaked away precious flow. Craftsmen learned to listen for subtle changes in sound, the difference between smooth passage and hidden obstruction. Knowledge moved through apprenticeship, not parchment. Boys who once chased geese along riverbanks grew into men adjusting sluices with intuitive precision. Measurement existed without instruments, accuracy without mathematics as we define it. The system worked because memory worked. And memory, once broken, could not be repaired as easily as timber. Seasonal calendars were drawn not on paper, but in muscle memory. Opening a canal too early chilled seedlings. Too late, and roots thirsted beyond recovery. Experienced farmers read subtle signals, the tilt of reeds, the color of upstream sediment, the tempo of snowmelt. Decision-making blended observation and intuition. There were no guarantees, only probabilities earned through repetition. Younger generations watched carefully, absorbing patterns without formal explanation. Precision emerged from habit. Water management became almost ritualistic, a choreography repeated each year with slight variation. The rhythm felt eternal. Yet beneath that rhythm lingered vulnerability no one fully controlled. Tools evolved quietly. Iron replaced weaker fittings and critical joints. Millstones grew larger, more efficient. Channels were lined with stone to reduce seepage. Each improvement seemed incremental, almost modest. Yet accumulated changes reshaped productivity. Surplus expanded steadily, almost invisibly. Wealth no longer relied solely on land ownership, but on mastery of systems running through it. Lords who invested in hydraulic improvements strengthened their estates without drawing swords. Infrastructure became strategy. Power began flowing through gates and wheels rather than armor. And those who failed to adapt watched neighboring regions prosper while their own harvests stagnated uneasily. Climate was never stable. Colder decades shortened growing seasons. Excessive rains eroded embankments painstakingly built. Adaptation became continuous rather than occasional. Some communities deepened canals to compensate for reduced flow. Others diversified crops, reducing reliance on single harvest cycles. Flexibility distinguished survival from decline. Written chronicles occasionally mentioned harsh winters, yet daily resilience rarely reached parchment. It lived in reinforced walls, adjusted slopes, revised routines. Water systems required constant dialogue with shifting weather. Nature did not negotiate politely. It tested assumptions without warning. And every test revealed which systems were truly understood and which merely imitated. When maintenance faltered, consequences arrived quietly at first. A neglected channel gathered silt. Flow slowed almost imperceptibly. Crops nearest the source thrived, while distant plots weakened. Inequality appeared in subtle gradients of green. Arguments followed. Accusations of favoritism circulated through markets and taverns. Water exposed tensions already present beneath polite cooperation. Systems designed for collective survival could fracture under selfish impulse. Repair required more than tools. It required renewed agreement. Meetings stretched long into candlelit evenings. Decisions carried weight beyond harvest yields. Because if trust eroded like an embankment, rebuilding it demanded far more than earth and timber. War complicated everything. Armies marching through fertile valleys rarely respected irrigation channels. Embankments were trampled. Mills were burned to deny grain to rivals. Years of hydraulic refinement could vanish in days. After conflict passed, reconstruction demanded both labor and memory. Some knowledge had been carried by men who never returned. Fields lay uneven, gates misaligned. Recovery tested resilience more severely than drought. Communities faced a choice: abandon complexity or rebuild it patiently. Many chose rebuilding because they understood something essential. Control over water meant independence from uncertainty. And independence, once tasted, was difficult to surrender. Disease altered labor availability without warning. Epidemics reduced workforces drastically, leaving complex systems understaffed. Irrigation demanded constant oversight. Fewer hands meant fragile oversight. Some channels clogged. Certain terraces cracked without timely repair. Yet paradoxically, reduced populations sometimes eased pressure on resources. Surplus per capita could rise if infrastructure endured. Survival depended on preserving knowledge despite loss. Elders taught children sooner than expected. Skills transferred in compressed seasons of urgency. Hydraulic literacy became inheritance of necessity. In those years, water management was no longer innovation. It was preservation. And preservation determined whether communities would recover or quietly disappear. Markets grew sensitive to water stability. Merchants calculated risk based on upstream reliability. Grain prices fluctuated with rumors of damaged gates. Hydraulic infrastructure quietly influenced regional trade networks. Investment followed dependable systems. Where water flowed predictably, credit flowed as well. Financial trust mirrored agricultural trust. A canal was not merely a ditch, it was collateral. Written contracts began referencing mill rights and irrigation access. Paper economies rested upon earthen walls. The abstraction of value traced back to physical flow. And in that relationship between mud and money, medieval societies stepped closer to structural complexity. Urban centers increasingly depended on rural hydraulic discipline. Cities required bread daily, regardless of weather upstream. Administrators monitored surrounding valleys carefully. Some invested directly in canal repairs beyond city walls. Infrastructure blurred boundaries between countryside and town. Responsibility extended outward. A damaged sluice miles away could incite unrest within crowded streets. Bread riots rarely mentioned irrigation explicitly, yet water lay beneath their anger. Stability required invisible cooperation across distance. Medieval governance matured through such interdependence. Control over water translated into control over social calm. And calm, once disrupted, proved far harder to restore than flow itself. By the late medieval period, water management had become embedded in identity. Regions were known for their mills, their terraces, their disciplined canals. Travelers described landscapes shaped as much by intention as by nature. Hydraulic systems reflected collective temperament, cautious, ambitious, resilient. They revealed how communities perceived risk and opportunity. Water was no longer merely resource. It was mirror. In its controlled motion lay evidence of cooperation, hierarchy, foresight. And yet beneath this sophistication remained a simple truth. The flow could still fail. One drought, one conflict, one neglected gate could remind everyone who ultimately held the advantage. Then came years when the sky withheld mercy. Rivers narrowed into uncertain threads. Mill wheels slowed to uneven turns. Irrigation channels, once confident veins, exposed cracked beds beneath shrinking flow. Communities rationed carefully, measuring survival in hours of access. Arguments sharpened. Old agreements were tested against desperation. Some regions adapted by drilling deeper wells. Others watched fields fade from green to brittle brown. Drought revealed which systems were flexible and which merely rigid. Control felt fragile again. Water that once obeyed began resisting quiet discipline. And in that resistance, medieval confidence trembled slightly for the first time. In contrast, sudden floods carried different terror. After prolonged dryness, storms struck with violent force. Hardened soil rejected absorption. Water rushed uncontrolled, breaching embankments once trusted. Fields drowned overnight. Grain flattened under muddy currents. Villagers worked through darkness, stacking sandbags, reinforcing gates by torchlight. Years of patient engineering strained under nature's abrupt reversal. Survival demanded immediate coordination. There was no time for extended deliberation. Instinct and experience guided decisions. Some barriers held. Others surrendered. By dawn, the landscape bore scars both physical and emotional. Water reminded everyone it was partner, never servant. Over time, lessons accumulated from failure. Channels were widened in vulnerable sections. Secondary spillways were added to redirect excess surge. Communities accepted that perfection was illusion. Resilience required redundancy. Water systems became layered, offering alternatives when primary routes faltered. This sophistication did not eliminate risk. It redistributed it. Decision-making grew more complex. Leaders balanced cost against precaution. Some investments appeared unnecessary for decades, until one extreme season justified every effort. Memory of disaster lingered in design choices. Engineering absorbed trauma silently. And with each modification, medieval landscapes carried invisible stories of survival etched beneath soil. Technological diffusion moved gradually across regions. Travelers carried observations along trade routes. A well-designed sluice in one valley inspired adaptation elsewhere. Innovation rarely remained isolated. Yet adaptation always reflected local terrain. No canal could simply be copied without adjustment. Knowledge required translation into soil and slope. That translation distinguished wisdom from imitation. Regions that understood this prospered steadily. Those that replicated blindly faced subtle inefficiencies accumulating over years. Hydraulic systems were never universal formulas. They were conversations with specific landscapes. And every landscape answered differently, demanding humility from even the most confident engineer. Gradually, water management shaped social imagination. People began seeing landscapes as modifiable rather than fixed. Control over flow suggested broader possibilities. If rivers could be guided, perhaps markets could too. If marshes could be reclaimed, perhaps scarcity could be reduced. Confidence expanded beyond agriculture. Mental frameworks shifted subtly. Infrastructure cultivated a mindset of intervention rather than submission. Yet that mindset always rested upon careful observation. Hubris risked collapse. The balance between ambition and respect defined sustainable progress. Medieval water systems embodied that tension daily. They demonstrated that mastery required listening as much as directing. Generations passed, yet some channels remained in use for centuries. Stone linings endured beyond the hands that placed them. Maintenance rituals became tradition. Children learned boundaries not only through fences, but through water paths traced in earth. Hydraulic heritage embedded itself in identity. Even when political regimes shifted, irrigation patterns persisted. Empires rose and fell. Canals continued guiding seasonal flow. Stability rooted in infrastructure outlasted banners and titles. This quiet continuity shaped regional character more deeply than proclamations ever could. And still, beneath that continuity, vigilance never ceased. Because neglect waited patiently for distraction. Occasionally, innovation accelerated unexpectedly. New gearing mechanisms improved mill efficiency dramatically. Output increased without expanding farmland. Energy from flowing water diversified into sawmills and metalworking. Rural economies gained complexity. Specialization deepened. Water became not only sustenance, but productivity multiplier. With diversification came new dependencies. Breakdowns affected multiple trades simultaneously. Repair urgency intensified. Skilled millwrights gained prominence. Knowledge clustered around technical hubs. Hydraulic systems evolved into integrated networks of labor and craft. What began as irrigation matured into early industrial logic. And that logic quietly prepared foundations for transformations yet to unfold. Yet progress never erased vulnerability entirely. A single harsh winter could freeze channels solid. Ice expanded within stone linings, splitting carefully placed blocks. Spring revealed damage concealed beneath white stillness. Repair required both urgency and patience. Each season reminded communities that mastery was conditional. Water cooperated within limits. Those limits were learned repeatedly, sometimes painfully. Resilience meant preparing for recurrence, not assuming permanence. Medieval water management thrived because it respected recurrence. Systems were built with expectation of stress. That expectation transformed fear into planning. And planning sustained life where chance alone would not suffice. By shaping water, medieval societies shaped themselves. Cooperation, hierarchy, innovation, restraint, all were rehearsed through channels and gates. The landscape became a classroom without walls. Every adjustment taught consequences. Every harvest reflected collective discipline. Control was never absolute, yet it was transformative. Hydraulic systems rewrote expectations of what communities could achieve together. They fostered habits of planning beyond immediate survival. In guiding rivers, people refined governance, trust, foresight. And in that refinement, something larger was forming quietly beneath the surface. A template for organized complexity that would echo centuries forward. Stand beside a quiet canal today and listen closely. Beneath the gentle current lies accumulated intention. Medieval water management was never only about crops. It was about negotiating uncertainty with patience and structure, about choosing cooperation over chaos. The channels still whisper lessons carved in earth. Mastery is temporary, vigilance perpetual. Every gate represents a decision repeated across generations. Every embankment carries memory of risk endured. Water continues to flow, indifferent yet responsive. And perhaps the most enduring legacy is this simple realization: civilization advances not by conquering nature, but by conversing with it.